Joining me now is former U.S. diplomat Jim Jatras. Jim, good to see you.
Thank you, Liz. Good to see you.
All right, Jim, just this week, the European Union extended sanctions against Russia for their continued involvement in Ukraine. Was this, in your opinion, the right move for the European Union?
No, I don't think it was, and there's no end to it. Basically, they're doing it for the sake of doing it because they don't know what else to do. That obviously Crimea is not going to go back to Ukraine, and the whole Minsk process in eastern Ukraine is completely stalled. These sanctions add nothing to that, but they don't know what else to do.
All right, is Russia abiding by the peace agreements in regards to Ukraine, though? Because it seems as though they're not.
Well, if you read the Minsk agreement, there's actually very little Russia needs to do. What the main responsibility there is on the part of the government in Kiev in Ukraine to pass a new law allowing for elections in eastern Ukraine to reintegrate those areas back in Ukraine. They were supposed to do that by the end of last year. That hasn't happened. It doesn't look like it will happen, so things are essentially in a frozen state.
What about the ceasefire? The ceasefire has already been signed, but there's still fighting happening in that area. That can't be according to the peace agreement.
No, but it's a lot less than it was. You have essentially probing from both sides, but it doesn't look like either side either has the wherewithal or the intention to return to large-scale hostilities. It could be a lot worse, and it was a lot worse before Minsk was signed.
All right, then talk to me a little bit about what's in the European Union's mindset in continuing these sanctions, because it doesn't seem like it's going to help improve relations with Russia if, in fact, Russia's abiding by the peace agreement.
Well, exactly right, and that's why you are seeing more and more people in the European Union, some countries, particularly Italy, but also within countries like the business community in Germany, saying this is nuts, this is hurting our business, it's not doing anything to solve the Ukraine crisis, that if Europe and Russia have a rapprochement, it'll be easier for both sides to work out a solution on Ukraine rather than this sterile confrontation, which is what we're left with.
All right, and this all comes at the same time, Jim, as you know, that the United States has accused Russia of bombing in Syria, bombing rebel groups, actually, that are U.S.-backed. And then Russia counters with an accusation that the United States is trying to topple Assad by propping up these terror groups. What do you make of that?
Well, you know, this is what really worries me, Liz. Here we are. We just suffered this attack in Orlando. We had San Bernardino. This is radical Islamic terrorism, not homophobia, not a gun problem. Why is it that the Obama administration is aiding radical Islamic groups in Syria, like Ahrar al-Sham, Jaish al-Islam? These are groups that are allied to al-Qaeda. And, you know, ISIS is not the only problem in Syria. These other groups have exactly the same ideology. And the Russian position is essentially, if it walks like a terrorist, it fights like a terrorist, it is a terrorist, let's bomb it. And the American position seems to be, or at least Obama's position is, we need to retain leverage by keeping some of the jihadist groups going. These are people that cut the heads off Christians and so forth, because we need to put pressure on Assad to step down. That's their position. To me, that simply doesn't make any sense. It's feeding the terrorist threat to us here in the United States.
Right. Well, maybe you can answer that question for us, then the one that you just posed, and why are they taking that strategy? Why are they doing that? Because we've seen historically that that's not a very effective strategy. And like you said, these are people that we're propping up with our resources. We're propping up people who are essentially our enemies.
That's right, and let's keep in mind, we did exactly the same thing in Libya. That was Hillary Clinton's baby. She was the one who set this policy in Syria. Why are we doing it? Because, as we saw in this memo from these 51 diplomats at the State Department, my former colleagues there, they're basically saying that geopolitics, putting pressure on Assad, thwarting the Russians, thwarting the Iranians, is more important than defeating ISIS and defeating radical Islamic terrorism. And we need to choose. We need to choose our priorities. If radical Islamic terrorism is the top priority, sometimes you have to cooperate with people like the Russians, even to some extent with the Iranians, that you might not agree on other things, but let's get our ducks in a row. What's our first priority? To me, it's radical Islamic terrorism.
Right, and not having these priorities in line, I think, have unintended consequences. And one of the ones is something that I mentioned in the introduction that I want to get to talk to you about now, and that's the fact that Russia and China are growing increasingly close. Those are both very powerful nations, very large nations that have ulterior motives, if you will, and they're growing increasingly close when Obama's not showing leadership in that area. Tell us about some of the consequences of this, because this is not something that we should look on lightly.
You know, this just shows the complete failure of statecraft of this administration. I can't help but think, for example, when you look at Netanyahu and Putin meeting, they get along with each other better than either one does with President Obama. Under Nixon, it was our policy to get along with Moscow and Beijing better than they did with each other. And somehow we seem to have managed to alienate both the Russians and the Chinese, where they do feel a commonality of interest because they feel that their basic security interests are not respected by the United States the way Eisenhower respected Khrushchev, the way Nixon respected Brezhnev, the way Reagan respected Gorbachev. This is deadly serious. Russia is the only country with a nuclear arsenal sufficient to destroy us. We should not be needlessly confronting them over things that do not involve vital American interests. And that's what I hope somebody like Donald Trump can bring to the table. What's in the American interest, not what's in the interest of a bunch of people at the State Department who really don't seem to know what they're doing.
Right, and we hear China's president talking about the fact that their number one priority is to protect their own sovereignty, and in a certain sense, you can't blame them for that. But then we see them also building up these islands in the South China Sea, which could be argued is an exercise in protecting their own sovereignty. So, what is the next president? Should it be Donald Trump, for example? What should he do to improve relations with China without giving away our leadership?
I think it's time to bring back a very good old concept that was in diplomacy for years and years and has been thrown in the trash heap, and that's called spheres of influence. When the United States was a small, not particularly powerful new country, President Monroe said, the Western Hemisphere is ours. This is our sphere of influence. You, the European powers, you stay out. Well, that's part of any power security to say, look, this is our neighborhood. We don't want you encroaching in it, and we will respect yours. And we don't do that anymore. And I think we need to start thinking about where our interests are vital and where they're affected and where they are not, and where we can make a deal with other powers.
Right, particularly in a day and age, I think, when it's so easily accessible to get to other countries, when travel, whether it's by air, by sea, by missile, it's so close. It's made our world a smaller place. I think that respect is vital. Jim, I appreciate your insight on this topic. It was great to talk to you. After the break, an attempt to take Donald Trump's life at his Las Vegas rally by a man who's in the United States illegally. Ash Scow is coming up next.